Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this live stream event from St. Andrew the Great. It's really, really good to have you with us. We're going to be starting properly in just a few moments' time. But as we do that, let me just first introduce myself. My name is Robbie. I work at St. Andrew the Great Church in Cambridge. We've been putting on a few different events like this since we've been in lockdown, streaming all our services, and then a few events as well called Real Lives, Real Hope, exploring the hope that Jesus offers in a world that is at the moment pretty hopeless, faced with the coronavirus situation and countless other things in which we feel out of our control. So if you're just joining us and you're part of our church family, you're very, very welcome. If you've been invited by a friend or someone else and you're joining us, then you're also very, very welcome. It's really good to have you with us. As I said at the beginning, my name is Robbie. I work at St. Andrew the Great Church in Cambridge. Welcome to this live stream event. Now, this evening, we're joined by Rebecca McLaughlin. She's a writer. She's actually written a book called Confronting Christianity. It's where we've got the title for this event, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. And we're going to be asking her questions. Actually, it's a chance for you to ask her your questions live. And just as we start, I'm going to say a few different ways in which you can do that. So here's the first. You're able to go to a website called pigeonhole.at. So just any browser on your phone or anything like that, just type in pigeonhole.at and then put in the password confronting. If you enter that password, then you'll be able to see other questions that people have asked, ask your own questions as well, and you'll be able to vote up different questions. Unfortunately, if you're watching this recorded, then you're not able to do that. But if you're live with us right now, then that's probably the best way to answer questions, actually, because I bet that there'll be people who want to ask pretty similar questions about the Christian faith. And you'll be able to see others and you'll be able to upvote them. And the ones that are most popular will be able to ask Rebecca. There's a couple of other ways, though. If you can't work out that website or whatever, and you don't mind it being a non-anonymous question, then just stick it in the YouTube chat or the Facebook chat, and we should be able to get it up for you. So that's how to ask questions. So welcome if you're just joining us. My name's Robbie. I work at St. Andrew the Great in Cambridge, and we're really pleased to have join us this evening for this live stream event, Rebecca McLaughlin. As I mentioned, she's an author. She's actually written this book. It's called Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. And the plan this evening is no questions off limits. You can ask her whatever you want. But let's get to know her first. So, Rebecca, I'm just bringing you up. Hi, Rebecca. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Robbie.
Thanks so much for joining us. It's lovely to have you. Now, I know that you spent some time in Cambridge. What was your connection to Cambridge?
Oh gosh, yeah, I was in Cambridge for my undergrad, MPhil and PhD. So I was there for 7 years, and I studied the same subject. I played for the same football team, and I went to the same church throughout that 7 years. And that church was St. Andrew the Great.
Brilliant. Oh, it's really lovely to have you back with us. Although you are actually in the States, you're tuning in from stateside. So just tell us where you are in the States.
Would you know, I'm in a place they call Cambridge here, but it's actually should be called New Cambridge in New England, because it's not the real Cambridge.
Wow.
And the thing that personally has been the biggest loss to me, and this, I know there are so many greater losses in the world from COVID-19, but the personal greatest loss to me is the fact that I'm not physically in real Cambridge now with you guys speaking face to face, because that was the plan. I would have been there from last Wednesday to today, and so it's heartbreaking to be missing that.
It's a real shame. We were planning some events, I guess a bit like this, exploring the Christian faith, an opportunity for people who are perhaps interested in Christianity to find out a bit more about it. And we were super looking forward to having you with us, but I'm glad that the technology exists that we can do this. I guess it's not like 8 p.m. at your time. It must be a different time.
It's not, it's 3 p.m. on a lovely sunny day over here in fake Cambridge.
So how's lockdown been for you in fake Cambridge? Because all the different around the whole world, people are having to deal with this coronavirus situation, and we've had people streaming in and stuff from all around the world. But how have you found it? Like, what's lockdown been like for you so far?
Yeah, it's been interesting for me. I've got 3 kids who are 9, 7, and nearly 2. So the fact that we can't go to parks is a big deal. The fact that the girls, my 9 and 7-year-old, can't go to school is a big deal.
Yeah,
they've been doing pretty well at home, it seems. Cambridge, like fake Cambridge here, recently instituted a law that you have to wear a face mask outside. It's like a $300 fine if you don't. I don't know if it's the same.
$300 fine. Wow.
Yeah. Not everybody is, because people don't always comply. But
yeah, that's quite different.
That's the deal. So Yeah, we have been, I mean, we feel very fortunate in that we have a tiny, like postage stamp size, what they call a side yard here, which in England would be called a garden.
Yeah.
So our kids can play outside, fairly freely before we have to put masks on. And in we're in a fairly densely populated part of Cambridge. So the fact we have any kind of grass to call our own is extraordinary. We feel happy, but it's definitely not like room to roam.
Yeah. And so I just want to find out a bit more about you. So firstly, I want to ask a little bit about your book. So I've really enjoyed this book, actually. It takes 12 kind of classic questions or tricky questions that people often ask about the Christian faith. Just tell us a bit, why did you write it? Like, who's it for, this book, and why did you write it?
Yeah, so there's a really long answer to that question, which I won't give you. I'll give you as short an answer as I can. After my PhD in English literature, actually, at Trinity College, hooray, I went to theological college for 3 years because I thought, the Church of England spends their money on a lot of really stupid things, so they might as well spend money on educating me. No offense to my Church of England friends. And then I moved to the States because I married a guy from Oklahoma, and he dragged me kicking and screaming across the pond nearly 13 years ago now. And then from being in the States, I spent 9 years working for an organization called the Veritas Forum, where one of my main roles was working closely with Christian professors at top secular universities, mostly over here, though also in the UK and other countries, so places like Harvard and MIT and Stanford and Cambridge and Oxford, who were very serious followers of Jesus themselves, and helping them to think about how to talk about their faith in a more public way. So we're probably all familiar with the kind of Richard Dawkinses of the world who speak from an atheist perspective out of their academic training and the sort of credibility they have from their discipline. We seldom actually get to hear from the thousands of Christian professors at equivalently prestigious universities doing world-class thinking on a range of topics. And after 9 years of working closely with all of these folks, I felt like I kind of had this almost like a roadmap of the best Christian thinking across a whole range of different topics. And I noticed that there was this, what felt like a massive information gap actually between what the average student who walks into, I don't know, like a psychology course in their first year might hear about Christianity or about reasons to believe or not believe in God, and what the world-class experts in that field, whether it was psychology or physics or history or mathematics or biology or whatever it was, what world-class Christian thinkers were saying. So I partly wrote the book to close that information gap. And I partly wrote it for people like my best friend, Natasha, who I was an undergrad at Cambridge with, and who is not a Christian herself, still absolutely my closest friend and someone I kind of interact with on a daily basis. Very intelligent, very well thought through, lovely, kind person who is not convinced by the Christian faith. And so I dedicated the book to Natasha and all my other fiercely intelligent friends who might do me the honor of reading this book and just exploring some of the what I think are actually very legitimate questions that some of my really clever non-Christian friends have. But I guess what I was saying in the book was, I think with each of the objections to Christianity, if you look more closely at it, it stops being a roadblock and starts to become a signpost to faith in Jesus.
Yeah. That's brilliant. And you do that. I mean, go through lots of different questions in this book and kind of take them and I guess treat them with a intellectual rigor and a kind of a helpfulness that I think is really, really, I find it particularly helpful. I mean, there's some of the questions that lots of Christians have also, as well as those who are exploring Christianity. So right. I think it's been really, really helpful. We're going to have a chance to basically ask you now lots of different questions. Just to show how this works for people who've tuned in a little bit later or whatever, we're going to, we're using mainly a website called pigeonhole.at. And actually, there's lots and lots of questions have come in. I'm going to put the most popular one up right now, which actually just follows on from a few things that you said, Rebecca. So this is just how it's going to work. There you go. Which football team did you play for whilst you were in Cambridge?
Well, I played for the Trinity women's football team, which it's funny because in America, soccer, as they call it, is very much a girls' sport. I mean, boys play it as well, but it's actually pretty dominated by girls. And so when I tell Americans that I played for my college football team, they're wildly impressed. Now, those of you who grew up in the UK will know that it's not really, at least in my generation, it wasn't really a thing that girls grew up doing. So I'm not actually very good. But I was even captain of the Trinity women's football team for a period of time.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, yeah, that does. Well, it doesn't sound quite as impressive, like, you know, in a Cambridge context, but
right.
We'll give you credit for anyway. And rocking women's football is a really cool thing. So there's a question that's come up on the chat. Is this book available on by audiobook? I think it is. It's available on Audible. And actually, there's a link for Rebecca's book down in the chat, in the comments section underneath this YouTube video. If you'd like to buy it, you can. We're going to make a kind of start. And there's a question here that I think actually is pretty topical, and I think it's a good one to start with. Here it is. Where is God in COVID-19? It's kind of the question of the hour, in a sense. I guess behind it, there's lots of things. Kind of, how could God possibly be at work? How could God allow suffering? What would you say in answer to this? Where is God in COVID-19?
One of the big questions that Christians have been rightly needing to answer for the last 2,000 years is, how could a God who is both loving and powerful allow suffering? And not just minor suffering, but the large amounts of pain and suffering that we see, everything from physical ailments or global pandemics to suffering caused by humans being unkind to each other. You know, how could a God who is both loving and powerful allow these things? And it's important to hold both those pieces together, because actually, if God is loving but not powerful, you could say, well, he can't help it. And if God was powerful and not loving, you could say, well, he doesn't care. And there are many ways I think Christians can legitimately approach this question. But to me, one of the most helpful is to look at what is at the very center of the Christian faith, and what actually marks Christianity out from any other global religion. And that is that at the absolute center of the Christian faith is the brutal, agonizing death of an entirely innocent man. And this man, Jesus Christ, wasn't just, according to the Christian story, wasn't just innocent, but he was also the most powerful man who has ever existed. He was a man who could calm a storm with his words. He was a man who could heal people even at a distance. He was a man who, according to the Christian story, actually created the universe in the first place. Everything in the world, including you and me, was in fact, according to the Christian story, created by this man, Jesus Christ. And yet here we see him naked and abandoned by his closest friends and judged by both his would-be friends and enemies, both the Jewish people he was part of and the Romans who would have been against him, dying this savage and suffering death. And so staked right at the heart of Christianity is a suffering man. A suffering man who is powerful, and also a suffering man who is profoundly loved by God. So this is one of the things I think we need to hold central to any conversation about Christianity and suffering, is to say, we tend to have this assumption that if God really loved us, he could not intend for us to suffer. And yet at the center of Christianity, we find the human being who, you know, you could say God most loved of all, suffering in ways beyond what any of us could possibly imagine. And if we start to read the Bible, you can pretty much pick up open your Bible to any page, or pick up a Bible from a friend, open it on any page. And almost without exception, you'll be finding words that are written by suffering people for suffering people. Now, the one exception I would say is the book called The Song of Songs in the Old Testament, which is lots about sex and love and that kind of thing. Not so much suffering there. But actually, most of the Bible is written by suffering people and for suffering people. So I think we need to hold those things in place, and then we need to ask ourselves, okay, what are the alternatives? So Christianity actually offers us a loving creator who tenderly and deeply cares for us in our suffering. In fact, meets us, the New Testament claims, in very specific ways as we suffer. We're comparing that to, I think for many of us, actually less other religious claims and more a kind of world without God. And I think one of the things that we struggle to do as 21st century Westerners is really staring in the face, what does that world without God look like? And here I think people like Richard Dawkins are actually quite helpful. So Dawkins says that the universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So we suffer whatever we believe. But as a Christian, I have the opportunity to find meaning in the midst of my suffering, and to know that the person who knows me best and loves me most has suffered for me and holds me close in my suffering. If we stare sort of bleakly at a world without God, there's no meaning to suffering. There's no good, no evil. There's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I guess the kind of where is anything in the COVID-19 situation, it's something that every philosophy and worldview and way of looking at the world has to answer. And I guess that is the unique thing about Christianity, that right at the very heart of it is a God who in his son knows what it's like to suffer. And actually that's part of the whole Christian message. It's right at the very heart of the Christian message, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here's another question about suffering. Just to slightly follow that up, I know that it's not got quite as many votes as some of the others, but I just thought it would follow on quite nicely. But how then does God choose who goes through the most suffering? As in, why do some people suffer a lot more than others? And I guess we could add to that, there's a lot of kind of, the coronavirus situation really exposes that, doesn't it? There's a lot of mess, there's a lot of injustice. It seems that kind of people who are poorer or in kind of more developing countries are suffering a lot more from this situation than, us in Cambridge, in both Cambridges. How does that all work? Like, why do some people suffer more than others?
Yeah. So again, I'd want to start by saying we can naturally have this assumption that the more somebody loves God or the more sort of favored they are by God, the less they're likely to suffer. And I think that assumption crumbles on every page of the scriptures, most notably with Jesus, but also even if you look at Jesus' first followers, like, the Apostle Paul, for example, suffered shipwrecks and beatings and abandonment and persecution and eventually martyrdom. Not because he was sort of running away from God, but actually because he was very much at the center of God's purposes in that moment. And Jesus was actually specifically asked as well. He was presented with a guy who was blind, and he was asked, who sinned, this guy or his parents? Like, what kind of moral act caused the suffering that this guy is experiencing? And Jesus' response that it wasn't either him or his parents. That we should never kind of, from a theological perspective, attribute that kind of suffering to like particular more or less sinfulness on somebody's behalf, though he did also say that any as we look at suffering, whether ours or others, it should actually be something that causes us to repent. So there's that sort of in the framework. I think the reality is we don't know. We're not privy to God's thoughts and motivations in all instances. Sometimes we get a glimpse of that, other times we don't. It's also certainly not the case, and just kind of play the flip side of that if you like me right now are living a pretty healthy and happy and sort of in many ways prosperous life, that's any sign of God's favor necessarily. And in fact, Jesus told a very alarming parable about a guy called Lazarus who was sitting at the gates of a rich man, and he was sort of starving and unwell, and eventually died in poverty at the gates of this rich man. But then in Jesus's story, Lazarus, the poor man, then ends up embraced by God, and the rich man is facing God's judgment and punishment. So I think from a Christian perspective, we must never say, this person is suffering because of any specific kind of sin. That all of us, partakers of sin, but it's not like, oh, well, this person's suffering worse than me because they're more sinful than I am, or vice versa. But I think it also, from a Christian perspective, we want to say anything that we might be suffering now will just fade into the background noise when it comes to either the glorious, extraordinary, beautiful life that anyone who's trusting in Christ is promised, or the terrible experience of God's judgment that anyone who's not trusting in Christ is warned of by Jesus himself. And I don't want to say that to sort of trivialize anybody's individual suffering now, but it's something that, again, the Apostle Paul, who had very serious experiences of suffering himself, said, like, actually, my suffering now isn't worth comparing to the glory and beautiful experience that I'm going to have with Christ in the future.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to make that caveat, that kind of point, isn't it? That because somebody suffers doesn't necessarily mean that they're any kind of worse person or anything like that. Jesus is very, very clear on that, isn't he? Like the passages that you mentioned, I think is in John chapter 9, isn't it? Where he says that they ask him who sinned, this guy or his dad or whatever. He's like, don't even think like that. Or in Luke chapter 13, and there's this kind of natural disaster. But Jesus said, well, actually, you're asking the wrong question if you're asking kind of what did they do wrong in order to die of a natural disaster.
Yeah.
But you're asking the right question if you need to think, if you think about what this suffering tells you about the brokenness of the world.
Well, it's interesting as well. So as I mentioned, I spent 9 years working with Christian professors, and some of them had grown up in Christian families. Actually, a large number of them hadn't and had come to faith at different points in their lives. And there are a couple of common sort of threads that I noticed in people who'd come to faith later in life. One was, people who'd gone to college and been challenged by Christian friends really to think through their own beliefs, and had figured out that actually some of the reasons they'd had for not considering Christianity just didn't hold up, and that really what they sort of thought they believed also didn't really stand very well, and they'd end up coming to Christ from a more sort of logical perspective. But for many, actually, it was some kind of experience of suffering in their lives.
Interesting.
And you may find, I don't know if you're tuning into this and you wouldn't consider yourself to be a Christian, it might be interesting to ask friends who would. And my guess is that you'll find, certainly a number who grew up in Christian homes, but those who end up becoming Christians, more in early adult or late adulthood, it'll often be because they went through a serious crisis in their lives. And you can say, well, that just shows that Christianity is a prop for the weak, and so many people call out to you in their desperation.
But I guess if there's one thing we're learning in the coronavirus situation, it is that we are weak.
Right, we are weak, and frankly, all of us will find times of desperation in our lives. And even if we live the most sort of comfortable, successful, happy, prosperous life, we are all going to die. And there will come that moment of desperation. If we have no hope beyond death, there will come that moment of desperation then, if not before.
I was struck by this article. A number of people might have seen it, and I saw it posted a few times on social media yesterday in The Guardian by a lady called Harriet Sherwood, who I guess must be a religion writer for The Guardian. And she notes this survey where I think 1 in 4 people in the UK have tuned into some kind of online service during the lockdown. And strikingly, and you think this is crazy given the kind of secular narrative and all that kind of thing, 1 in 3 people aged between 18 and 34 have tuned in or listened to some kind of online service. And you think it does really kind of something like suffering and something like this situation does really perhaps expose some weakness and things. And you're right, it can be a real opportunity to find something out about Christianity.
And it's interesting on that point, and these stats are from the US, so I can't swear to them being the same in the UK, but I'd be surprised if they weren't. You hear a lot in the US about the growing proportion of people who are described as nuns, as in not people wearing kind of habits and religious people who, if you gave them a survey saying, what is your religious belief, they would check the box, tick the box that says none. And the category of people who would tick that box in America has grown dramatically in the last couple of decades. And so people have this perception that, okay, non-belief is on the rise and religious belief is declining. But what turns out to be the case is that it's actually it's a very unstable category to be in, the atheist, agnostic, none kind of category. It is something that people can sometimes sort of stick with through their lives, but it's hard to find multi-generations of people who would not identify with any religious belief, because actually it's not how human beings thrive to be. I mean, just look from a data-driven perspective. I'm not even saying this from a perspective of faith. I think that's true as well. And so you'll see a lot of switching in and out of that category. A number of my Christian friends were raised non-religious and then came to faith themselves, and their parents are sort of perplexed by it. But it's very hard to find 3 generations of non-religious people. Maybe you're the exception, somebody tuning in, maybe your parents and grandparents are all non-religious, but it's actually relatively hard to find.
Yeah, well, let us know if that's you in the chat or in the kind of questions or whatever. I think we're going to slightly change to a different question now. There's been a few that I like this. Let me just get 2 up. I guess on the subject of hell, really. So here's the first. Wasn't it selfish of God to create mankind when he knew that the net result would be negative for mankind? Most will spend an eternity in hell, just so that he can have more glory in the eyes of the saved. So wasn't it selfish? And I guess a similar one, I'm just going to hit them together if that's okay. This one coming up now. how is it fair that people who have rejected God out of anger in this life due to personal disasters, e.g. rape, brutalized family members, go to hell, and likewise people who have never heard the gospel? So it's a question about kind of, is it fair that people get sent to hell or whatever, and why did God set it up in the world up in this way anyway, if lots of people go to hell?
Great questions. If you find the time to read my book, there are 12 questions I look at in the book. The last one is, how can a loving God send people to hell? And I said in the intro to that chapter, and I'll say it again now, I think that is the only truly hard question for Christianity. It's far harder than any questions about sexuality or science or even suffering. It is the question, how can a loving God send people to hell? And there are multiple different kind of ways that we could approach this. And this could be our entire conversation today and for the next sort of 3 weeks. And I'm not for a minute saying that I would even have all the answers. But I think one helpful way of thinking about this is that we often see kind of heaven and hell as places to which people are kind of arbitrarily sent on the basis of whether they sort of mentally assent to various statements. And it seems sort of random, actually, for many of my friends who aren't deeply familiar with Christianity, it seems kind of random to be like, well, if you put your trust in this man who died 2,000 years ago and was supposedly raised from the dead, that kind of gets you a ticket into heaven. And if you don't, then that gets you the ticket into hell. I don't know if The Good Place, that TV series, is popular over there in the UK, but it's been popular here. And there's sort of like lots of kind of weighing in the balance of like, who's good and who's bad, and shouldn't there be a medium place of people who are kind of pretty good but not terrible, like rather than having this stark dichotomy of heaven and hell. And I think one of the problems with that way of thinking, if we actually go back to the Bible, is that heaven and hell biblically are less about a place and actually more about a relationship. And those who trust in Jesus are in a relationship with the person who created them, first and foremost. So the person who actually kind of owns us in the first place, having made us, and the person who has offered them a relationship of extremely deep intimacy, taken the punishment for their sin when he died on the cross, and sort of invited them into a very specific, extremely intimate relationship with him. And so heaven is not primarily about like, won't lots of nice things happen and won't we get, all our favorite toys, as it were, but actually more about living in that relationship with our creator and with our redeemer. And one way to think about hell, the opposite of that, is actually being deprived of all the things that Jesus is. And Jesus in the New Testament claims that he is the light of the world. So if we take that claim seriously, then being without Jesus means living in terrible darkness. Jesus claims that he is the bread of life in a culture where bread was the staple food. So being without Jesus means being sort of desperately hungry. Jesus claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. And so being without Jesus means being utterly and finally lost and dead. And I think we don't realize from sort of where we're sitting now quite how much depends actually on our relationship with Jesus. And all of us right now have some form of that relationship. If we are trusting in him and his death in our place, then we're in relationship with him. One of the pictures the Bible gives us is like a husband and wife who are united in one flesh together in a sort of unbreakable bond. Another is that we're actually part of his body, like even more sort of indissoluble somehow. And if we reject Jesus, then we're in relationship with him ultimately as our judge. Now, I say that to sort of just frame the conversation a little bit, because like I say, I think we sometimes kind of have misconceptions about what heaven and hell even mean in the first place. So then to go back to the original question, well, how is it loving of God to create so many human beings, many of whom actually haven't put their trust in Jesus and as far as we can see from the scriptures, wouldn't be enjoying that relationship and that beautiful relationship with him forever? But I think one of the answers is actually we don't know what the final proportion of humans who will end up in, in beautiful relationship with Jesus or facing him as judge will be. We don't know when God's going to call time on this universe. And actually, I think it's right to say that there are more Christians more humans living today than there have been at any point in history. If sort of add up, somebody can fact check me on this, but there's something along those lines that actually the global population today compared to what it was historically is actually massive. And contrary to popular perceptions, Christianity isn't this sort of small and dwindling group of people. It's actually the largest global belief system, and it's the largest and growing global belief system. It's also the most racially, culturally, and geographically dispersed of any belief system, including kind of atheism. And so I think it's actually much too early to say that most people are not going to die trusting in Jesus and live with him in this beautiful relationship forever. Now, we're still left with the reality that many, many people, as far as we can understand from the scriptures, will be facing God as judge rather than being welcomed into his kingdom forever. And that is a very sobering truth. And I say that it's sobering for a couple of reasons, not least that my understanding of myself as a Christian is that I actually deserve not to be welcomed into heaven. And if there was an analysis done of my sort of like in The Good Place, that TV series, if there was an analysis done of my actual moral caliber, I'm not even close. And it is only by the grace and mercy of Jesus that actually any of us are saved and taken to be with him forever. So I think it is a painful and heartbreaking question, however you look at it. But I do think that there are ways in which we kind of maybe bring our own misconceptions to that question. Robbie, I don't know if you want to follow up on that. I feel like I've given a far from adequate answer. I'm not hearing you anymore, Robbie.
Sorry, thanks for reminding me. I had my mic muted. Yeah, thanks. No, that's really helpful, and it's right to take a long time answering it because as you say, it's a tricky question, and it's one that has lots of perhaps kind of personal things behind it, perhaps for people or individuals. And I think I was struck. One of the things that really struck me when I read that chapter in your book is just how you focused on this idea of judgment, God as a judge and a righteous and a kind of right judge, a fair judge. And actually how that is something that immediately you perhaps balk at and you think, goodness, I don't like the idea of judgment. But then actually, particularly in our culture at the moment, and I guess a lot of people around the world would deeply care about issues of justice and fairness and rightness. And I think you just made a very good point in your book about how kind of God's that right that God has to judge, he will not I guess there'll be nobody on that day who says, yeah, I've been treated unfairly either way. And I guess that's perhaps something that deserves a bit more exploring and a bit more reading about. But
yeah, I've been thinking recently about just kind of ways to get our heads around this. And one of my thoughts is, when you're reading a cartoon and they have the speech bubbles, but then they also have the thought bubbles. And I thought to myself, imagine if you and I had a little thought bubble that came out of our heads that anybody could read anytime. If that were true of me, it would destroy all of my relationships. Like even the people I really like. I mean, even if you pick the people in the world I like the most, and maybe you can think, of whether it's a husband or a wife or a mother or a child or your best friend, like somebody you really like. And then imagine that person having a transcript of your thoughts for even 24 hours.
It's pretty scary.
It's terrifying. I mean, maybe it's very possible I'm a worse person than you are. And I've often had conversations with friends who are not Christians where they're like, gosh, you must be a much worse person than I am. Like, it's very possibly the case. But I only really have the data of my own mind and heart to go on. And I can pass as like a decently nice person to others, but they don't see the transcript. There was a TV series called House MD. Again, I don't know if it was popular in the UK as it was here. It was Hugh Laurie playing this hard-bitten Chicago doctor when he really just should be playing Bertie Wooster. It was ridiculous. in one of House's patients was this guy who had somehow, from some bizarre like disease or brain damage, lost his inhibitions to where he would just say whatever was in his mind. And it was absolutely destroying him and everyone around him. And in the episode, he opts to have an operation which will probably kill him. It's like he's got like a 20% chance of surviving this operation. But if he does survive, it will bring his inhibitions back. And he wants to do the operation because you cannot exist as somebody whose thoughts are just projected out into the world. All the relationships are gone. Yeah. And for me, one of the extraordinary things about Christianity is that the one person who does see a transcript of my thoughts nonetheless loves every inch of me. Like the person who knows me the best actually loves me the most as well. And I think all of us, to some extent, go through life kind of managing appearances a bit, to where we'll show people the angle on us. We'll even probably disclose like hidden things to certain people in ways that will maybe make them like us more.
Yeah.
We're quite careful about it because we don't want to show them all the things that will make them run away. All of that's gone. If Jesus is who he says he is, he sees every thought of our hearts, and yet he loves us enough to die for us.
Yeah, and I think that's got to be the kind of way to end, in some ways, the question on hell. There are things about it that have caused us to have lots of questions, and at the end of the day, there are probably some more things to say that we haven't said here. But the kind of heart of the Christian faith is a God who himself comes in the person of his Son to take the judgment that we deserve, the kind of hell that we deserve. And that's something that Christians have believed for thousands of years. And it's what makes, I guess, Christianity such good news. When you see the I guess the seriousness of our predicament, it's what makes Christianity such great news. It's why Christians sing. It's why they're excited. It's why they might have invited you to an event like this, because they want to share that. They don't want to tell you, kind of hit you over the head with the idea of hell, but they want to show you Jesus's love. And I guess that's kind of such an important thing for Christians to say. Another question here. There's a couple of questions here about God's will. So here's one. If God knows, can I get it up? There we go. If God knows every decision we are going to make, why don't we just ride life out without putting effort in? Because it's all part of God's plan anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of determinist view. There's another question as well that you may want to just perhaps briefly answer in there as well. Is there going to be free will in heaven? Will we not be able to make wrong decisions?
Yeah, our church until recently was walking through the New Testament, St. Paul's letter to the Romans, and he actually specifically answers that first question in a slightly different way, because if God knows everything, and particularly from a Christian perspective, if you're trusting in Jesus, and God not only knows everything but actually also has covered any and all of your sins in Jesus's redemptive blood, to where actually at the end of the day, however many times I screw up between now and the day when I die, actually I'm still completely forgiven. Why don't I just go around doing whatever on earth I want to do? Like, who cares whether I'm loving and generous and self-sacrificing or not? And again, just before I give a Christian answer to that question, I want to sort of put it side by side once more with an answer from the perspective of atheists. I don't know if folks are familiar with Sam Harris. He's an American guy, but he was one of the four kind of most prominent new atheists, along with Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. We had two Brits and then two Americans, Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris. And he wrote a book in 2012 called Free Will. And one of the things he said in that book was the idea that we as conscious beings are deeply responsible for our mental states and subsequent behaviors is simply impossible to map onto reality. So he's claiming from an atheist perspective that there is demonstrably no such thing as free will. It is pure delusion. And the more that I read of atheists and agnostic intellectuals and authors, the more I think they don't believe in human beings any more than they believe in God, funnily enough. So there's another guy who, a professor at MIT, which is down the street from me here, one of the top universities in America. He's an agnostic and physicist and science writer. And he, when asked about, what does he believe? He said, our consciousness and our self-awareness create the illusion that we have some sort of ego power, some special I-ness, some unique existence, when in reality we are nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. Like literally, he's saying there is no such thing as Rebecca McLaughlin. I am purely deluded in thinking that I am an individual with any kind of coherent moral being. And from Sam Harris's perspective, I'm definitely deluded in thinking that I'm making any real moral decisions. So again, like, let's just have that side by side to say, you know, from an atheist perspective, there's no human making the decisions in the first place. Now, for Christians, and this is a conversation I've been having with my 7 and 9-year-old recently, so they have really interesting and helpful questions. We're presented in the Bible with this interesting tension, or kind of two sides of a coin, between, on the one hand, God's what we call God's sovereignty, like God's rule and power over all things, and on the other hand, actually our real decisions. And so you see this, you can see this played out in multiple stories in the Bible, and also in the New Testament letters, which kind of explore the theology. But let's think for a moment, like bringing it back to the central claim of Christianity, of Jesus's death and resurrection, and ask the question: well, why was Jesus on the cross? Like, whose fault was it, or whose will was at work when Jesus was on the cross? And one answer to that is, well, it was the will of the religious leaders around him who wanted him executed. And that's true. Another answer is that, well, actually, it was the will of the Roman soldiers who were nailing him to the cross. It's also true. But another angle on it is, actually it was God's will, even though those religious leaders and the Roman soldiers were doing things profoundly sinful, that it was also, in fact, God's will that was happening. And Jesus, so famously, while he was on the cross, prayed for those who were nailing him to it and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So on the one hand, we see at the cross something that God had planned from eternity past coming about. And on the other hand, we see the result of individual humans and groups of humans at the time doing things. And I think we see that played out, as I say again, in multiple passages of the scriptures, that we have both human decision-making and God's sovereignty kind of together like this. And it's one of those things about the Christian faith that we cannot fully wrap our minds around. And I think that to some extent, if everything about Christianity was something we could fully wrap our minds around, it frankly would not be a big enough belief system to encompass this crazy world in which we live. I mean, even, I don't know if folks have a scientific background, but there are many things that we now know through science that it's basically impossible to really wrap your mind around. And so I think I'd want to hold those two pieces in tension together to say, actually, yes, God does rule over all things, and I myself make real moral decisions every day.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Okay, a couple of questions here. I reckon there's one from each side of the pond here. So here's the first. People associate Christianity with Westboro Baptist Church, Republicans, Fox News, assuming it's middle class, intolerant, and anti-gay. Do you recognize this characterization, and how would you respond? That seems to be from an American side. Here's the I think the British version. Why is evangelical Christianity so middle class?
Oh wow, I love it. So many questions in that question, which is great. I'll take bites at it from various angles. The first is to say the common perceptions about who you imagine when you think evangelical Christian are actually quite misaligned with the reality of the global church. So in America, when somebody hears the word evangelical Christian, they probably think of a white man from the South who may or may not be racist, in fact, probably actually kind of is racist. It probably isn't particularly well educated, though. I mean, I think that people often have this sort of perception of somebody who's probably like wealthy and middle class, but not necessarily well educated. All the things that folks on the coast in America love to hate is the sort of perception of the evangelical Christian. And what's one of the most sort of perplexing things, I think, for folks who, when they start to look at the actual data around who it is, both here and globally, who in fact represents evangelical belief, and just to kind of undo the Christianese a bit there. I broadly define an evangelical as somebody who has a very high view of the Bible as the authoritative word of God, and who believes that Jesus's death and resurrection in our place and for our salvation is absolutely central to the Christian message, and that you need to sort of personally accept those things in order to be welcomed into God's kingdom. Just a very sort of brief sketch of what that might look like. And probably also somebody who's keen to share that message with others. In fact, the most typical person who identifies with those beliefs, both here and globally, is actually a woman of color. So the two demographics most likely to be atheist are white Western men and folks in communist regimes, though actually China, the largest communist regime, seems to be rapidly Christianizing right now. So when you think atheist, you should think of a white man or somebody in an oppressive communist regime scenario. When you think Christian, you should probably think of a black woman. And evangelical Christians are predominantly, like globally actually, they come from all sorts of demographic sort of levels and education and wealth, etc. But millions and millions of very much sort of poorer, less educated people, as well as those folks who I've been getting to know at these top universities, doing world-class research on various questions. So when we think about the demographics of Christianity, we tend to get it quite wrong. And one of the points I frequently want to make is that actually, if we care about diversity, Christianity is the greatest movement for diversity in all of history, without question. And that's true of racial diversity. It's also true of sort of gender, in terms of the fact that always from the very beginning, as far as we can tell from research and records, most Christians have been women rather than men. So let's have those pieces in play. Then let's think about this kind of Westboro Baptist Church, anti-gay, intolerant sort of thinking. Now, for those, again, who aren't familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church, it is an incredibly small group of people, actually, specifically the Westboro Baptist Church. It's basically some guy's family, like extended family, and some people in the family have even left it. So it by no means represents even any significant denomination in America. Now, having said that, sadly, there certainly are people who identify as Christians, particularly in America, who would have some of the ways of thinking and of being in the world that we might associate with Westboro Baptists. For example, going around with placards saying God hates gays and that kind of thing. And I think the piece that you and I are probably most offended by in that picture of the Westboro Baptist Church is the attitude of those people towards folks in the LGBT community. Now, here's a time where I really want to carefully distinguish between a couple of different things. So there's the technical understanding of meaning of homophobia is somebody who has a dislike or distrust of gay, lesbian, or bisexual or transgendered people. And that is something that I don't think Christians should be guilty of. Now, clearly, many Christians, both today and in history, have been guilty of that. I don't think it's something that the Bible gives us at all. I think instead, the Bible gives us very clear boundaries around sex. And it was very countercultural, actually, as much in the first century it is now, to say sex only belongs in an exclusive marriage between one man and one woman that is permanent for life and faithful. That was completely shocking in the first century, because men, it was fine for them to sleep with other women and actually other men as well. It wasn't expected that they would be faithful to their wives. And it's similarly kind of shocking now to say, actually, that is what the Bible gives us as the model for a sexual relationship. But one of the pieces that I think is often missing from this whole conversation is, what is the logic behind that from a biblical perspective, rather than just like God randomly dislikes various kinds of people. And the logic is that we see throughout the Bible this thread of a metaphor, actually, which pictures God as, in the Old Testament, as a faithful husband, and Israel as his often unfaithful wife. But there's sort of marriage between God and his people, which then comes into much sharper focus in the New Testament as Jesus declares himself to be the bridegroom. Paul pictures human marriage as a little kind of scale model of Jesus' relationship with his church. And at the end, the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, there's this massive proclamation that the wedding of the Lamb, a word for Jesus, has come, and Jesus' marriage to his people brings heaven and earth back together. So we have this massive picture of what marriage is meant to point us to through the scriptures. And we often kind of completely forget that when those of us who are Christians sort of talk about why the Bible gives us boundaries around sex. But I would then want to say what the New Testament says about people engaging in sexual relationships with those of their same gender is really offensive. Like I want to be clear about it. It's offensive, but it's actually impossible to read almost any page of the New Testament without being offended, because it calls out our behaviors of all kinds continually. I was just the last couple of days reading through Jesus's famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, and seeing the moral standards that Jesus gives us, and recognizing I fail every single one of those tests. So there's actually no way to read the New Testament without being personally offended for yourself, whether you're in a heterosexual marriage, or whether you're in a gay marriage, or whether you're sleeping with multiple men or women on a daily basis. There's no way to not be offended. And the one sort of last piece I'd like to bring into that is to say, for as long as I can remember, I've always been more attracted to women than men. It's sort of a slightly kind of funny joke on God's part that I've been happily married to a man for the last 12 years, but it's actually, I'm the most typical kind of same-sex attracted person, as in a woman who is attracted to other women, but not necessarily exclusively so to where she couldn't possibly have a relationship of that sort with a man. And I think I want to say that to say, like, this is a personal issue for me. I didn't come to the Bible kind of looking for a justification of my homophobic views. I actually, would have been in many ways sort of quite happy to find that the Bible said it was okay for me to marry another woman. And though as I've read the Bible more and kind of learned more about the bigger picture of what's being said, I don't think I want that anymore. Not because my orientation has changed, but because I think I've started to see the beauty of both how marriage in the Bible points us to Jesus and his church, and how the gospel just releases us into different kinds of relationships. So this common sort of mantra that love is love. I actually want to say from a Christian perspective that God is love, and that God gives us pictures of his love in different sorts of relationships. So husband and wife is one, but so is parent and child. It's a very important picture of God's love in the Bible. So is friend. I mean, Jesus said, greater love had no one than this, than he laid down his life for his friends. So that the love that I experience in friendship with other women is a beautiful picture of Jesus' love for me. I get glimpses of God's love as I interact with my kids, as I think, gosh, God loves me like a nursing mother. The prophet Isaiah uses that picture. God speaking through the prophet Isaiah says, can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. So I think what I've learned, and I'm continuing to learn, is that actually all the different kinds, like the full palette of human relationships, at their very best, give us a tiny glimpse of what it means to be loved by God, and that he created all those kinds of relationships for that purpose, and that the boundaries that he gives us in the scriptures actually enable us to enjoy them in different ways. So husband and wife is different from parent and child, is different from same-sex friend. And so I think I see now the beauty of those pieces of the Bible, which I think probably 10 or 15 years ago would have, or at least certainly 15 or 20 years ago would have felt like frustrating to me.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that as well, Rebecca. Very personal thing. And I guess one of the big things about all of what you're saying, in a sense, is the kind of the judgments that we sometimes make about Christianity or evangelical Christianity or whatever. When you go back to the original source material, the Gospels, the kind of eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, those documents about the early church, like we've just been reading through in some of our student groups at church, the book of Acts. and you see this diverse and multicultural and kind of variegated group of early Christians that includes rich and poor and men and women and all sorts of different ethnic groups.
Yeah.
And you think, actually, we can have a bit of a skewed view, I guess, partly maybe because of the media or whatever, just kind of. And I guess the challenge for people is, if you've not actually read one of those eyewitness accounts of Jesus for yourself as a kind of thinking adult, then, I mean, why not do that? I guess there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I was thinking about the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, those ones that I was just mentioning, these kind of eyewitness accounts written by first century physician, I guess trying to persuade other skeptical first century people of the reality of what had happened, what happened with this person, Jesus Christ. Just on the, oh, sorry, Rebecca.
You flagged Luke there, Robbie, because I think that Luke's gospel, each of the four gospels gives us just sort of like a different angle on Jesus in a beautiful way. And you'll notice in Luke's gospel, Jesus's consistent care for the poor and the marginalized, and Luke's consistent paralleling of men and women. And in every parallel, women come out better. It's kind of fun.
We're coming, I think, pretty much to a close on these. We've got a few more questions, I reckon, that we can squeeze in the next 5 or so minutes. Here's one from Facebook. I guess picking up on some of the stuff that you just said. Lovely picture of a cat there. Does God give up on us if we fail often as Christians?
No.
Thanks. Do you want to kind of expand a bit more?
I can speak to that from personal experience. If God gave up on us because we fail often as Christians, he'd have given up on me years ago. I don't know you, Robbie, but my guess is he'd probably have given up on you as well.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I love, actually, one of the reasons I am very convinced that the New Testament Gospels are authentic is because of quite how embarrassing they were for the first Christian leaders, who continually screw up, including like Peter, one of the greatest like leaders of the early church, who was very much sort of still around when the Gospels were being put together. It records him denying that he even knew Jesus 3 times, the same night that he told Jesus he was going to die with him if need be. So
this is the guy that becomes the leader of the kind of early church.
Yeah, and so like if the Gospels were made up, there's no way they would include those kinds of embarrassing stories. And I think they're partly there so that you and I would know every day as we screw up as a Christian that actually it doesn't depend on our moral success. It really does depend on Jesus's moral success on our behalf.
Brilliant, thank you. A question here from back on Pigeonhole about miracles, and there's another one that I'll perhaps add together as well with this. So nowadays we don't really see miracles taking place, yet they seem to happen quite a lot in the Bible. How can we be sure that these miracles in the Bible actually happened? And I guess that's part of a broader question, which this person asks as well. What reason do I have to actually trust the Bible? We've talked about these eyewitness accounts of Jesus's life. They're full of miracles and, first glance, slightly weird stuff. Like, why should we trust those as historical?
Oh, so much to say. I'm currently doing a weekly email where I'm featuring a different Christian professor from a top university each week and kind of telling a bit of their story. And a couple of weeks ago, I featured a guy called Ard Louis, who is a professor at Oxford. Sorry to mention the other place. He's professor of physics at Oxford, an absolute world-class physicist. And he grew up in Gabon in East Africa. And his parents were scientists and taught in a mission school there. And he says one of the biggest reasons that he is in fact a Christian is because of the faith of his friends growing up and the miracles that he saw and heard of. So I guess just to say, first of all, it's not actually the case that miracles don't happen anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that we should assume that anyone who claims that they've seen a miracle is necessarily speaking the truth. I think there are many kind of false and crazy claims of miracles. And I do think it doesn't surprise me that miracles today seem to happen quite a lot more in situations where there is far less in terms of kind of medical science available. So just to say, I'd slightly contest the idea that there aren't any miracles anymore. But thinking about the miracles in the Bible, I mean, it seems completely crazy to some extent to look back and say, okay, we're talking about this guy who supposedly could heal people, supposedly could walk on water, supposedly could calm a storm, and supposedly was raised from the dead. Like, that's the biggest, most crazy miracle of all. And it hasn't, like, modern science taught us that sort of thing couldn't happen. And there I want to say, well, actually, no, partly because the people who originally came up with what we now call science were Christians. And they first devised the modern scientific method because they believed in a creator God who was both rational and free. Second, because I know a whole raft of leading scientists who absolutely believe in the resurrection and believe in Jesus' miracles. And thirdly, because from a theological perspective, the Bible claims that God created the universe, but it also claims that he sustains it. And that if God were at any point to sort of stop sustaining the universe, then it would just cease to exist. And so if you can get your head around the idea of God creating, then the idea that there could be times when very unusual things happen because God wills it isn't actually hard to believe at all. Like if there's a creator God, it's like a much bigger deal to believe in a creator God than to believe that that Jesus could perform miracles. So then you have to say, well, isn't it crazy to believe in a creator God? And I'd say, well, no, because as I say, the first scientists believed it. And actually, if you put atheism and Christianity side by side, it's kind of crazy both ways. It's crazy to believe in a creator God for sure. It is also crazy to believe in a universe that exists without cause or purpose, which is kind of what you're left with if you're an atheist.
Thanks, brilliant. Yeah, I love the line that we had. Another friend of the church, Glenn Scrivener, whose video actually that he preached at Easter Sunday is on the stag.org/hope website. You're very welcome to go and visit that if you'd like a bit of an explanation of the Christian faith. He says, everyone already believes in two massive miracles, that something came from nothing and that life came from non-life. And you think actually those pretty amazing and miraculous things that I guess don't necessarily prove, but certainly point to or make or kind of fit plausibly around the idea of their God being a creator. A God who made something out of nothing can surely make a man rise from the dead, and particularly if that person is God himself. I guess we're pretty much coming to the end. There's a lot more questions on the pigeonhole.at website that we've not had time to answer, and I'm really sorry about that. If that's you, if you've asked a question on there and we haven't gotten around to answering it, I just want to mention a couple of quick ways in which you can perhaps follow up to something that you've heard in this video. It might be that something that you've heard sparked a bit of interest that you'd like to keep exploring more or asking more questions about Christianity. Perhaps you'd like to spend some time reading one of those eyewitness accounts for yourself with a friend or something like that. A few different ways to follow up. I reckon the first one is to just get in touch with the person that invited you to this event. If you got sent a link through a friend on WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever, and you're interested in finding out more, why don't you ask them about some of the reasons why they're a Christian? And if you're up for it, they might well be up for reading a bit of the Bible with you together, perhaps walking through one of those Gospels. A chance for you to ask your questions. There's lots of brilliant resources online to do that. And I think that, to be honest, that's the best way to really explore more. We're all in lockdown. Some of us are very, very busy because we have particularly important key worker jobs and things. But for others, there's a bit more space and time, particularly in the evenings or whatever. There may not be another chance like this to really explore Christianity and the claims that it offers. You lose basically nothing. If you read about Christianity, you learn about the biggest religion in the world and something that's been massively influential for many different cultures for the last 2,000 years. But there's so much to be gained because both Rebecca and myself and all of us at St. Andrew the Great Church in Cambridge really believe that this guy Jesus was the real deal, that he really was God in the flesh and that he really has died for sin and risen to new life to offer hope for this world. So there's so much to gain and not really anything to lose in exploring a little bit more about the Christian faith with a maid. It may be that you just clicked onto this link randomly, or you perhaps like to find out a bit more. You can also go to our website, stag.org/more, stag.org/more, and fill in your details there. Perhaps it would actually be really helpful to have lots of feedback from this event. We've not really done anything like this before. We'd love to hear how you found it. So you could go on there and just get in touch with us. And perhaps if you've had a question on pigeonhole.at that's not been answered, and you'd like a kind of response to it, but you kind of left it anonymously on the Pigeonhole website, then you can stick that in there as well. And someone from our church would love to get in touch with you. That's pretty much it, I think. Rebecca, it's been really lovely to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Virtually.
Some of the links for things we talked about, so how to buy the book, which I thoroughly recommend, 12 more questions that Rebecca's spent some time thinking about and answering. Also, I think that the link to those Christian professors, is that right? You're doing that every week during the lockdown.
Yes.
So that's down in the bottom of the YouTube things as well, and the link to the stag.org/more website too. That's pretty much all from us. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone else for tuning in.
Thanks, Robbie. Bye, everyone.
Bye.